The church is referring all questions to that statement. It doesn't get into a lot of specifics, but it comes just a month after the pastor reassured everybody he's just fine.
Inside a multi-million-dollar estate in Georgia, behind towering gates and carefully maintained silence, a hidden story waited for years before finally coming undone. The man who once filled massive stadiums with sermons of faith and power left behind more than memories when he died. What surfaced from his world shocked even his most loyal followers, forcing them to question everything they thought they knew about him, his ministry, and the empire he built. The IRS document that changed everything. It didn't come with a sermon, a headline, or a public announcement. It came as a quiet filing inside a courthouse in DeKalb County. But its impact hit like a shockwave through everything Bishop Eddie Long once built. Months after his burial, when most people expected the story to slowly fade into memory, a federal document surfaced that pulled his name right back into public scrutiny. The Internal Revenue Service had officially placed a lien against his estate and his widow, Vanessa, demanding payment of over $335,000. On paper, it was a standard financial claim. In reality, it reopened questions many thought had already been buried with him. This wasn't just about unpaid taxes. It was about a system collapsing under its own weight. The same man who once moved through Atlanta in luxury vehicles, even drawing media attention for his Bentley, was now tied to a federal notice that suggested unresolved financial obligations stretching beyond his lifetime. And the timing made it even more unsettling. While his name still carried influence in religious circles, the legal record told a different story, one of mounting pressure, debt, and accountability that could no longer be avoided. Inside his own ministry, the numbers were just as heavy. What started as a small congregation had grown into a massive megachurch, but behind the scenes, reports of financial strain were already surfacing. Millions in obligations, shrinking membership, and a growing gap between the image presented and the reality inside the organization. And just when it seemed like the questions couldn't go any deeper, another layer was waiting to be uncovered, one that didn't just involve finances, but the very life story that shaped the man behind the pulpit. A father's shadow that never left him. Before the fame, before the influence, and long before the massive crowds, there was a boy growing up with a quiet ache he could never fully explain. Eddie Lee Long was born on May 21, 1953, in Huntersville, North Carolina. At first glance, it looked like a simple upbringing, but inside his home, life was shaped by the presence of his father, Reverend Floyd Long Jr., a Baptist minister whose authority didn't stop at the church doors. For young Eddie, faith and pressure were closely intertwined, and love often felt like something that had to be earned. His father was respected in public, but at home, the atmosphere was far more rigid. Expectations were high, discipline was strict, and approval felt just out of reach. Growing up in that kind of environment left a lasting imprint on him, shaping how he viewed respect, power, and acceptance. Over time, that early experience turned into something deeper, a desire not just to succeed, but to rise above the limitations he once felt trapped under. After finishing school, he attended North Carolina Central University, where he studied business. For a while, his path seemed ordinary, even stable. He later worked at Ford Motor Company as a sales representative, learning how to communicate, persuade, and navigate people with confidence. But even then, something inside him was still unsettled, as if his real direction had not yet revealed itself. That search eventually led him to Atlanta, where he enrolled at the Interdenominational Theological Center. It wasn't just education anymore, it was a turning point. The pulpit his father once stood behind became the very thing he now wanted to step into himself. But before the rise, there was already a hidden chapter most people never knew about. In 1981, Eddie Long married Deborah Houston. On the surface, it was just another personal milestone. But years later, details from their divorce resurfaced through legal records that painted a far more complicated picture of that period in his life. The allegations that emerged during the proceedings were strongly denied by his legal team, Yet the documents remained part of the public record, quietly following him long after the case had ended. From that marriage, a son named Edward Long was born, a detail that would later become even more significant inside the very ministry Eddie would go on to build. By 1987, he stepped into New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia. At the time, it was a struggling congregation with only a few hundred members. There was no global spotlight yet, no empire, and no massive influence. Just a young preacher arriving with ambition, intensity, and a vision that was still taking shape. And as he took that first step into the pulpit, something inside the church and inside him quietly began to shift. Because what was forming wasn't just a ministry, it was the beginning of something much bigger and far more complicated than anyone could see at the time. And that rise was about to change everything. A father figure built for the crowd. When Eddie Long stepped into New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, it was far from the powerhouse it would later become. The congregation was small, the influence limited, and the future uncertain. But what came next was not just growth. It was transformation on a scale few could have predicted. Within a few years, attendance began to multiply rapidly. The church expanded far beyond its original size, eventually growing into one of the most recognized megachurches in the United States. Tens of thousands of members filled its services, and the ministry stretched across massive property developments, media attention, and national influence. But Eddie Long wasn't just building a church. He was building an identity. He presented himself in a way that demanded attention the moment he entered a room. His sermons carried a mix of intensity and confidence, often blending religious teaching with messages about success, authority, and personal power. Over time, his public image became larger than life, almost untouchable in the eyes of his followers. He often described the church not simply as a place of worship, but as a global organization with reach far beyond Georgia. Meetings with high-profile figures, political connections, and public appearances added to the growing perception that he was more than a pastor. He was a leader with influence that extended into spaces most churches never reached. The physical expansion matched the image. A massive cathedral rose from the church grounds, capable of holding thousands in a single service. Acres of land were acquired. Resources increased, and with every milestone, the ministry's presence in the public eye grew stronger. But behind the polished image and public admiration, there were aspects of his leadership that stood out in ways that made people both impressed and uneasy. He often spoke about authority in deeply personal terms, especially when describing his connection with younger members of his congregation. At times, he used language that blurred the line between spiritual mentorship and something far more intimate in tone. To his supporters, it was seen as discipline and guidance. To critics, it raised questions that were rarely spoken aloud. Still, the growth continued, the influence expanded, and the more powerful he became, the more control he seemed to hold over the environment he created. At its peak, New Birth was no longer just a church. It had become a system of belief, loyalty, and leadership centered almost entirely around one man. But as the spotlight grew brighter, so did the shadows around it. Shadows that would soon begin to surface in ways no one inside the congregation was prepared for. Because what looked like success from the outside was about to be challenged by voices that had been silent for far too long, and they were finally ready to speak. The lawsuits that shook the church. It didn't happen all at once. It started quietly. Then suddenly, everything came crashing in. In September 2010, legal documents began appearing one after another in DeKalb County. At first, it looked like isolated complaints, but as more filings surfaced, a pattern began to form, one that no one inside the church was prepared to confront. 4 young men stepped forward with claims that would send shockwaves through one of the largest congregations in the country. Their names were Morris Robinson, Anthony Flagg, Jamal Paris, and Spencer LeGrand. All of them were once connected to Eddie Long's ministry in a program designed for young men who lacked father figures. What they described was far from ordinary mentorship. According to the lawsuits, the relationships began when they were teenagers, during a time when they were most vulnerable and searching for guidance. Jamal Paris stated he was only 14 years old when he first met Eddie Long. He said the bishop told him to call him Daddy, a detail that would later become central to the allegations. Spencer LeGrand shared a similar experience, recalling how Long told him, "I've got you. I will be your dad." That phrase, simple on the surface, became the foundation of something far more complicated. The young men described being elevated into what was referred to as spiritual sons. But that title, according to their accounts, came with expectations and boundaries that went far beyond traditional mentorship. They alleged that their lives became closely controlled, from who they could speak to how they spent their time, and even how they were perceived by others outside the church. They were given material support, cars, clothing, apartments, electronics, and financial assistance. But they also described increasing isolation from their previous lives. Friendships were cut off. Family communication became strained. Their world, as they described it, began to revolve almost entirely around the bishop. Some of the most disturbing claims involved private ceremonies. The young men alleged there were candlelit gatherings where vows were exchanged, jewelry was given, and scriptures were read in settings that felt deeply symbolic and personal. Their legal representation later described these events as resembling marriage-like ceremonies, a comparison that added even more intensity to the already explosive allegations. Travel also became part of the picture. International trips were described, destinations including Africa, the Caribbean, and other locations, where the boundaries between mentorship and personal relationship were allegedly blurred further. One account described a hotel incident overseas that added another layer of controversy to the unfolding case. Then came the evidence that made headlines. Photographs reportedly sent from Eddie Long's BlackBerry surfaced publicly, showing him posing in a tight muscle shirt. The image, paired with a caption referencing faith and grace, quickly spread across media coverage and intensified public scrutiny. As the lawsuits gained attention, emotions inside and outside the church began to fracture. Some supporters refused to believe the allegations, while others demanded answers that were never clearly given. The tension grew so intense that it was no longer just a legal matter. It became a national conversation about power, influence, and accountability. Then came the moment that froze everything. Eddie Long stood before his congregation and addressed the accusations directly. In a now infamous moment, he compared himself to David facing Goliath and said he had 5 rocks, but had not yet thrown any of them. The reaction inside the church was immediate and emotional, with supporters standing in applause. But behind the scenes, the case did not disappear. By 2011, the lawsuits were quietly settled out of court. No full public trial unfolded, but the questions didn't settle with the paperwork. Instead, they lingered, growing louder with time, waiting for the next piece of the story to surface. And that next piece wasn't about lawsuits anymore. It was about something far deeper: how money, property, and power were actually woven into the foundation of everything he built, and what that trail would eventually reveal. The hidden transactions of power. While the public debate focused on scandals and courtroom claims, another layer of the story was quietly unfolding in property records and financial documents. And what those records revealed began to reshape how people understood the mansion that stood behind those iron gates. The chain of ownership didn't follow a simple path. In 1997, land connected to the church was transferred into a charitable entity associated with Eddie Long. Not long after, that entity secured a mortgage worth approximately $1.16 million to acquire the property that would later become the bishop's residence. Then came a series of transfers that raised even more questions. In 2003, the property was moved out of the charitable structure and placed directly under Eddie Long's personal name. On the same day, a new loan of around $300,000 was taken against it. Over time, additional mortgages were added, creating a layered financial structure that became difficult to untangle at first glance. By 2006, the property was transferred back to the church again, adding another twist to an already complex paper trail. Each shift in ownership blurred the lines between personal residence, ministry asset, and charitable property. At one point, Eddie Long himself acknowledged under oath that Bishop Eddie Long Ministries and Eddie Long were essentially one and the same. That statement alone became a key detail in later discussions about how funds and assets were managed within the organization. Investigations later revealed that church-related funds had also been used to cover expenses connected to the property, including taxes and even costs linked to private assets. Reports suggested that hundreds of thousands of dollars in property-related obligations were handled through church resources, further tightening the connection between personal benefit and institutional funding. Beyond the mansion, there were also questions about how influence was used within the congregation. Eddie Long introduced financial figures and investment opportunities to his members, including individuals who were later accused of running fraudulent schemes. Some church members ended up losing significant amounts of money after trusting endorsements made from the pulpit. By this point, the narrative had moved beyond allegations and legal disputes. It had become a question of structure itself, how leadership, financial systems, and influence were so closely connected that separating the individual from the ministry was nearly impossible. Everything appeared tightly woven into a single framework that sustained both authority and operations. Just as the broader picture seemed to be forming, however, another dimension remained hidden beneath the surface. This next layer was not simply about assets or finances, but about something more personal and revealing, pointing to deeper realities unfolding behind the walls of the growing empire. When the story finally came full circle, when you step back from the headlines, the lawsuits, and the financial records, the story eventually circles back to a single location, the estate behind the gates on Hunt Valley Drive. For years, it stood as a symbol of success, influence, and spiritual authority. But as the layers of the story unfolded, that image slowly began to change. What many people expected to be uncovered inside the mansion was something dramatic or sensational. Rumors circulated, theories spread, and speculation grew louder over time. But the reality was far less theatrical and far more unsettling. There was no hidden vault of riches, no secret room filled with unexplained treasures. Instead, what the records and timelines pointed to was something that couldn't be locked away or physically discovered. It was the system that made everything possible in the first place. By 2006, the mansion had already been transferred back under the church's name, meaning the property itself was no longer a personal asset in the way many assumed. Yet the symbolism of ownership never really disappeared. In practice, the boundaries between the church, the ministry, and the man who led it had become so blurred that separating them on paper meant very little in reality. Everything functioned as one interconnected structure. Financial decisions, leadership authority, and institutional identity all orbiting around a single central figure. After Eddie Long's passing, the leadership vacuum exposed just how dependent the entire system had become on him personally. Successor Bishop Stephen Davis stepped in, but his tenure was short and unstable. He later resigned, pointing to internal conflict and pressure within the organization. The transition that was supposed to bring stability instead revealed how fragile the structure really was without its founder at the center. Even succession choices became complicated. Eddie Long's own son, Edward Long, was considered but ultimately not selected to lead the church. Instead, leadership eventually shifted to Bishop Jamal Harrison Bryant, who inherited not just a congregation, but also a reported multi-million-dollar debt that weighed heavily on the ministry's future. Outside of leadership, the personal story of Eddie Long's widow also resurfaced in public discussion. Vanessa Long had initiated divorce proceedings during the height of the controversy in 2010. only to withdraw them shortly after. The decision was later fully reversed, and she eventually spoke about choosing to remain in the marriage, even through the storm surrounding it. But perhaps the most revealing part of the entire story wasn't found in court documents, sermons, or leadership changes. It was in how the system itself had been built. Layer upon layer of influence, loyalty, financial dependence, and spiritual authority concentrated into one center of power. That structure didn't collapse overnight. It slowly unraveled piece by piece, as the weight of everything connected to it became too large to contain. And when the dust finally settled, what remained wasn't just the memory of a controversial leader. It was a reminder of how easily influence can shape belief, how power can reshape boundaries, and how an entire empire can be built not just on faith, but on the people who trusted it. Because in the end, the fortress on Hunt Valley Drive was never just about what was inside the walls. It was about everything that was built around them, and everything that finally came crashing down when those walls could no longer hold the truth. Outro. If this story made you think differently about power, faith, and influence, share your thoughts in the comments below. And before you go, watch the next video on screen. You might uncover another story that changes how you see everything again.